I didn't know I was about to overhear something that would quietly change how I understood my place in my daughter's life. I wasn't looking for answers, and I certainly wasn't expecting the truth. I just stopped by her house without calling, stood near the window for a moment, and listened a little longer than I should have. Before I go further, please subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes knowing someone is listening makes it easier to keep going. It wasn't a special day. No birthday, no holiday, nothing that should have made the moment feel important. The morning had passed quietly, the way mornings often do when there's nowhere you need to be and no one waiting on you. I stood at the kitchen sink longer than necessary, rinsing the same cup twice, watching the water run, adjusting the temperature without really thinking about it. When you've lived alone long enough, small habits fill the spaces where conversations used to be. That was when the thought came to me, not suddenly, not urgently, just gently. I haven't seen her in a while. It didn't feel like worry. It felt more like noticing the passage of time, the way you realize the seasons have changed when the air feels different on your skin. I told myself I'd stop by, just for a moment, just to say hello. I didn't need to call. I never had before. When she was growing up, I didn't call. When she moved out, I didn't call them either. I was her mother. That had always been enough. I put on my coat, picked up my keys, and locked the door behind me. The sound of the lock echoed down the hallway, sharper than usual, but I ignored it. Some sounds linger when the house is quiet. The drive across town felt familiar, almost comforting. Every street held a memory, a grocery store where I used to buy her favorite cereal, a stoplight where she once called me after work, exhausted, asking if I could make soup because she didn't have the energy to cook. I remembered how I'd said yes without thinking, already reaching for my purse before the call even ended. Those memories didn't hurt. Not yet. They felt warm, like proof that what we had once was real and solid. Her street came into view, neat and orderly, lined with houses that looked settled into their places. I slowed down as I approached her home, already picturing the look on her face when she opened the door. Surprise first, then a smile. That was how it used to be. That's when I noticed the car. It wasn't parked carelessly. It wasn't blocking the driveway. It was just there, neat and intentional, like it belonged. A car I didn't expect to see. I told myself not to overthink it. People visit. Lives overlap. I parked a little farther down the street than usual and stepped out of the car. The air felt cooler than I expected. I pulled my coat closer as I walked toward the house. Everything looked calm. Curtains drawn just enough. No movement inside. No sound drifting out. I stepped onto the walkway and raised my hand to knock, and then I stopped. There was no clear reason. No noise that startled me. No thought that explained it. My hand just hovered there, inches from the door, while a quiet hesitation settled into my chest. Not fear, something softer. A pause I didn't understand but didn't ignore. I lowered my hand. I told myself I'd wait a second. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she'd open the door on her own. Instead, I took a step to the side, closer to the window. I wasn't trying to look in. I wasn't trying to listen. I just needed to understand why my body had decided to stop me. That's when I heard voices. At first, they were indistinct. A laugh. A few words that didn't quite reach me. Then another voice joined in, lower, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I leaned closer without realizing I was doing it. I recognized my daughter's voice immediately. Of course I did. But it sounded different, lighter, more relaxed than I'd heard it in a long time. She wasn't rushed. She wasn't distracted. She sounded comfortable. The other voice spoke again and they laughed together, their laughter. I told myself to step away. To knock now and announce myself before I heard something I didn't need to hear. But my feet didn't move. I stayed where I was, listening, while the conversation drifted on easily, carelessly, the way people speak when they believe they're alone. Then I heard my name, not spoken harshly, not with anger. Just mentioned, casually, as if I were a topic, not a person. My breath caught without sound. What followed wasn't cruel. That was what made it harder to bear. It wasn't sharp or emotional or filled with resentment. It was practical, assumptive, spoken as if a decision had already been made and didn't need revisiting. They talked about me the way you talk about something settled, something that no longer requires attention. I stood there, the realization sinking slowly into my bones. They weren't expecting me today, not because I hadn't called, but because in their minds, my presence didn't need to be considered anymore. Time stretched in a strange way. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough to understand that this conversation wasn't meant for me. Long enough to hear how easily they spoke when they believed I was nowhere near. I thought about knocking. The thought passed through my mind like a door opening and closing again. If I knocked now, everything would change. The tone would shift. The words would soften. Explanations would appear. And I would never again hear the truth spoken so freely. So I didn't knock. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound, careful not to disturb the moment they didn't know they were giving me. When I reached the end of the walkway, I turned around without looking back at the house. Some things are easier to carry when you don't watch them disappear. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel, steady but cold. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter, heavier, like the ground had shifted beneath a life I thought I understood. As I drove away, one thought repeated itself with calm, devastating clarity. Nothing had gone wrong. I had simply arrived at the truth without being invited. I didn't go straight home. I drove without a destination for a while, letting the streets decide for me. Familiar roads blurred into unfamiliar ones, and I followed them without questioning why. It felt important not to arrive anywhere just yet, as if stopping too soon would force me to face something I wasn't ready to name. At a red light, I realized my hands were still cold. Not shaking. Just cold, like they'd been holding onto something metal for too long. I wrapped my fingers around the steering wheel a little tighter and waited for the light to change. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me the way it always did. Quiet, patient, unchanged. I sat in the car for a moment longer, engine off now, listening to the sudden absence of sound. Then I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. My coat hung on the same hook. The chair by the window waited where it always had. The faint smell of morning coffee still lingered in the air. Nothing in the house had moved while I was gone, and that somehow made the weight in my chest feel heavier. I set my keys down carefully, as if noise mattered, and walked into the living room. I sat in my usual chair without turning on the lamp. Daylight filtered in through the curtains, soft and indirect, settling across the floor. For the first time since I'd stood outside her window, I allowed myself to replay the conversation in my mind. Not the exact words. Those were already blurring. What stayed sharp was the tone. The ease, the absence of hesitation. The way my name had come up and passed without consequence. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean what I thought it meant. That people say things they don't fully believe. That context matters. That I'd only heard a fragment of a longer conversation. But deep down, I knew better. There are truths you don't need explained because your body recognizes them before your mind does. The pause at the door. The cold in my hands. The way my feet hadn't moved when I told them to. I had been listening to the sound of a door closing that I didn't know had already begun to shut. The afternoon passed without shape. I made tea I didn't drink. I picked up a book and read the same paragraph over and over without absorbing a single sentence. The clock moved forward in small, deliberate increments, each minute landing exactly where it should, indifferent to the fact that something in me had shifted. At some point, my phone buzzed. I looked at it too quickly, my chest tightening before I even saw the screen. It wasn't her, just a notification, something unimportant. I turned the phone face down on the table and left it there. I told myself not to check it again. If she called, I'd answer. I wasn't avoiding her, I just wasn't reaching out either. There was a difference, I told myself, a meaningful one. That evening, as the light faded and the house grew dimmer, I found myself standing in the hallway, looking at a framed photo I hadn't paid much attention to in years. My daughter stood beside me in the picture, younger, her arm looped through mine, smiling wide and unguarded. We were both looking at the camera, unaware of how much life was still waiting to complicate us. I studied her face, trying to find the version of her I'd heard through the window earlier that day. The ease, the confidence, the distance. I wondered when that distance had begun. If it had crept in slowly, disguised as independence, or if it had arrived all at once while I was busy believing everything was fine. That night, I didn't sleep well. I woke often, drifting in and out of shallow dreams where I stood outside doors that wouldn't open, listening to voices that faded when I leaned closer. Each time I woke, I lay still for a moment, checking the quiet of the house, reminding myself where I was. Morning came without ceremony. I made breakfast out of habit, not hunger. Toast went cold on the plate while I stared out the kitchen window at the yard, where nothing ever seemed to change unless you paid close attention. The grass needed cutting. A leaf clung stubbornly to one branch long after the others had fallen. I thought about calling her. The thought rose and fell several times throughout the morning, never quite settling. I imagined her answering cheerfully, asking how I was, telling me about her day. I imagined myself responding the same way I always had, carefully, pleasantly, as if nothing had happened. And then I imagined asking the question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. So I didn't call. Instead, I went about my day slowly, deliberately, as if moving too quickly might cause something to break. I folded laundry that didn't need folding. I wiped down surfaces that were already clean. I kept my hands busy because stillness felt dangerous. By afternoon, the quiet had shifted. It was no longer peaceful. It pressed in on me, filling the corners of the house, settling into spaces where conversation used to live. I found myself wondering how long it had been since she'd last stopped by unannounced. Since she'd called just to ask if I was home. Since she'd needed me without planning it first. Independence, I reminded myself, was a good thing. It was what I'd raised her for. I told myself that what I'd heard didn't mean she didn't love me. Love changes. Love grows up. Love takes different shapes. But there was a difference between love changing and love reorganizing itself without you. That evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was her. Her name lit up the screen, familiar and suddenly heavy. I stared at it for a moment longer than necessary before answering. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice warm, casual, unchanged. "Hi," I replied, surprised by how steady I sounded. She asked how I was, told me about her day, mentioned something small and ordinary, the way people do when they believe everything is normal. I listened. I responded in the right places. I laughed softly when she did. If anyone had been listening, they would have heard a perfectly ordinary conversation between a mother and her daughter. What they wouldn't have heard was the space between the words. She didn't mention my visit. Of course she didn't. She didn't know I'd been there. She didn't know I'd stood outside her window and learned something she hadn't intended to teach me. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time with the phone still in my hand. That was when I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. I could continue like this. I could pretend. I could keep answering calls, smiling through conversations, accepting the version of myself that fit neatly into her life now. One that required notice, planning, boundaries I hadn't been asked to agree to. Or I could sit with the discomfort long enough to decide what it meant. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm. We spoke occasionally, not less than before, but not more either. Everything sounded the same on the surface, but underneath, I was listening differently now. Not for what she said, but for what she didn't. I noticed how often she filled silences quickly, how she redirected conversations away from certain topics, how rarely she asked questions that didn't have easy answers. None of it was dramatic. None of it could be pointed to as proof of anything. And yet the truth I'd overheard remained, steady and unchanging. I didn't bring it up. Not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I was afraid of resolution that required me to unhear what I'd heard. Some truths lose their power when spoken aloud, softened by explanation and apology. I wasn't ready to let that happen. Instead, I waited. I paid attention. And slowly, quietly, I began to understand that the moment outside her window hadn't been an ending at all. It had been the beginning of a decision I hadn't yet made. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It didn't announce itself or demand attention. It came quietly, in fragments, scattered through ordinary moments I would have once ignored. A pause before answering her questions. A breath held a second longer than usual. The growing awareness that pretending required more energy than honesty ever had. I began to notice how often I adjusted myself when we spoke, how I softened my opinions before sharing them, how I avoided certain topics altogether. I had been doing it for so long that it felt natural, like muscle memory, like something I'd learned without remembering when. But now I saw it. And once you see something like that, it's difficult to return to not knowing. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway again, looking at the same framed photograph. The one of us together, Her arm looped through mine, both of us smiling as if the world had been kind and would remain that way. I studied the image carefully, not with nostalgia this time, but with curiosity. I wondered when I had started believing that love meant shrinking quietly so someone else could feel more comfortable. That evening, she called. Her voice sounded the same as it always did, easy, familiar, warm enough to reassure anyone listening that nothing was wrong. She talked about her day, about something small and inconvenient at work, the kind of thing that resolves itself by morning. I listened, nodded even though she couldn't see me, offered the right words at the right moments. Then there was a pause, not an awkward one. Just a natural break in the conversation where, usually, one of us would fill the space quickly. This time I didn't. "Can I ask you something?" I said. The pause on her end was brief, but I noticed it. I noticed everything now. "Of course," she replied. I looked down at my hands, resting calmly in my lap. They weren't shaking. My voice, when I spoke again, surprised me with how steady it sounded. "Do you ever feel like we don't really talk anymore?" I asked. "Not about anything important." She laughed softly, not unkindly, not dismissively, just lightly as if I'd said something unexpected but harmless. "What do you mean?" she asked. I took my time answering. I wasn't trying to trap her. I wasn't trying to accuse her. I was trying to understand where the distance lived and whether she could see it too. "I mean," I said slowly, "we talk about your day and the weather and little things, but sometimes it feels like there's a lot we don't say anymore." There was another pause, longer this time. "I don't think that's true," she said finally. "I'll tell you everything." I let that sit between us. I didn't argue. I didn't contradict her. Instead, I asked a different question. "When was the last time you told me something difficult?" I asked. "Something you weren't sure how I'd react to." She didn't answer right away. In that silence, I felt something shift. Not dramatically, not painfully, just enough to let me know we had reached the edge of something neither of us had planned to discuss. "I don't know," she said at last. "I guess I don't want to worry you." There it was, the familiar explanation, the one I'd accepted for years without questioning. "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant it. "But sometimes it feels like I'm being protected from my own life." She sighed softly. "Mom, I'm not upset," I said gently. "I'm just trying to understand." Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Not drastically, but enough for me to hear the difference. It sounded more careful now, more deliberate. "You know I love you," she said. "That's not the issue." "I know," I replied. "I've never doubted that." What I didn't say was that love wasn't what I was questioning. We ended the call shortly after that. Nothing unresolved on the surface. No raised voices. No hurtful words exchanged. But when the line went quiet, I sat there for a long time, listening to the absence of her voice. I realized then that the conversation hadn't been about answers. It had been about acknowledgement. And in that sense, it had already given me more than I'd expected. The days that followed felt different, not heavier, clearer. I began to pay attention to how often I minimized myself in other areas of my life too. How I declined invitations because I didn't want to impose. How I framed my needs as inconveniences, even to myself. I wondered when that had started. Whether it had grown out of love or fear, or some quiet mixture of both. One morning, as I was sorting through a drawer I hadn't opened in years, I came across a stack of old letters. Notes she'd written as a child. Cards filled with uneven handwriting and unfiltered affection. I read them slowly, smiling at the way she'd signed her name with exaggerated loops. I missed that version of her. But more than that, I missed the version of myself who believed she didn't need permission to belong. That afternoon, she called again. This time, her tone was different from the beginning. There was an edge to it, not irritation, but something close to concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You sounded different the other day." I considered my answer carefully. "I am," I said. "I just think I've been quiet for a long time." She didn't respond immediately. "I don't want you to feel like you can't talk to me," she said eventually. "I know," I replied. "And I don't want to feel like I have to choose my words so carefully that I stop saying what matters." Another pause. "I didn't realize you felt that way," she said. I believed her. That didn't make it hurt less. "I don't think you meant to," I said. "Most distance isn't intentional." We talked longer than usual that day, still cautiously. Still circling certain topics rather than stepping directly into them. But there was a difference now. an awareness on both sides that something had shifted and couldn't be shifted back. I didn't mention the visit, the window, the conversation I'd overheard. Not yet. That truth still belonged to me alone, and I wasn't sure when or if I wanted to share it. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying the moment outside her house less often. Not because it had lost its meaning, but because it had already done its work. It showed me where I stood. What I did with that knowledge was up to me. I began to make small changes. I said no when I meant no. I spoke up when something mattered to me. I stopped apologizing for asking questions. None of it caused conflict. None of it drew immediate attention. But I noticed how differently I felt afterward. Lighter, straighter, more present in my own life. Then one evening, she called with a request. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. She needed help with something practical, something she could handle on her own but preferred not to. As she explained, I felt a familiar instinct rise, to agree immediately, to rearrange my plans without thought. This time I paused. "I can help," I said. "But it would need to be tomorrow, not tonight." There was a brief silence. "Oh," she said. "Okay." No disappointment, no frustration, just acknowledgement. When the call ended, I sat quietly, surprised by how much that small exchange meant to me. It wasn't about the timing. It was about the balance. I realized then that confrontation didn't always look like raised voices or dramatic revelations. Sometimes it looked like reclaiming space slowly, steadily, without asking permission. The truth I'd overheard hadn't broken me. It has clarified me. And I knew, as surely as I'd known not to knock that day, that the hardest part of this story was still ahead. Because clarity has a way of demanding action. And eventually, the truth you keep to yourself asks to be acknowledged out loud. I didn't decide to tell her right away. After everything that had shifted between us, there was a quiet understanding that didn't need to be rushed. We spoke more often now, but we spoke differently too, with less performance, less politeness, more pauses that didn't feel awkward. Still, the truth I carried hadn't lost its weight. It waited patiently, like something that knew it would be acknowledged when the time was right. That time came on an ordinary afternoon. She called and asked if I could come by the following week. She didn't sound urgent, just thoughtful. There was something she wanted to talk about, she said. Her voice was careful in a way that suggested she already knew the conversation might matter. When the day arrived, I drove over calmly. No rehearsed words, no tightness in my chest. I noticed that before anything else, how steady I felt. That steadiness told me more than any plan ever could. I knocked this time. She opened the door quickly, smiling, stepping aside to let me in. The house looked the same. Familiar. Comfortable. It didn't feel like a place I had to earn access to anymore. We sat at the kitchen table. Sunlight came in through the window, settling softly between us. She poured coffee. I watched her hands move, confident, capable, familiar in a way that made me proud without making me feel unnecessary. She spoke first. About work. About decisions she was weighing. About life moving forward in small, steady steps. I listened fully, not distracted by what I was holding back, not bracing myself for a moment that hadn't yet arrived. Eventually, she stopped talking. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me. "About distance." I nodded, inviting her to continue. "I don't think I realized how much I assumed you'd always just be okay," she said. "I didn't mean to take anything away from you." "I know," I replied, and I meant it. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no urgency to justify herself, just honesty spoken carefully. I rested my hands on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my palms. "There's something I need to tell you," I said. She looked up at me, attentive now. "I came by your house a few weeks ago," I continued. "I didn't call first." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You did." "I did," I said. "I was going to knock, but I didn't." She waited. "I stood by the window," I said quietly, "and I heard a conversation that wasn't meant for me." The room didn't tense. It didn't collapse into silence either. It simply grew still, like it understood the importance of what was being said. Her eyes dropped to her coffee, then back to my face. "I didn't hear anything cruel," I added. "That matters." What I heard wasn't unkind. It was settled, as if my place in your life had already been decided without me. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to explain. She listened. "I didn't know you were there," she said finally. "I know," I replied. "That's why it changed something for me." She sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing that. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more measured. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not just for what you heard, for what it meant." I believed her. But what mattered more than the apology was what followed. "I don't want you to feel like you have to wait to belong," she said. I didn't realize that's what was happening. "I didn't realize it either," I said. "Until I did." We talked for a long time after that, not in circles, not in defense, just honestly. About how independence can quietly turn into distance. About how comfort can lead people to stop checking in. About how love doesn't disappear, but it can rearrange itself without permission if you're not careful. When I left that day, nothing felt dramatic or unresolved. There were no promises made in a rush. No declarations about how things would always be from now on. But there was clarity. And clarity, I'd learned, is far more reliable than reassurance. In the weeks that followed, the changes were small but consistent. She called without needing a reason. She asked for my opinion and waited for it. I noticed myself speaking more freely, without editing my thoughts before sharing them. And when I visited, I knocked, not because I felt uncertain, but because I no longer needed to test my place. One afternoon, I realized something that surprised me. I hadn't thought about that day outside her window in a while. Not because I was avoiding it, but because it no longer held power over me. It had done what it came to do. Life continued as it always does. There were busy weeks and quiet ones. Sometimes we saw each other often. Sometimes we didn't. And for the first time, the difference didn't feel like a measure of my value. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner at her house, she paused and looked at me. "I'm glad you told me," she said. "So am I replied. She hesitated, then added, "I think I needed to hear it the way you said it, without anger." I nodded. "Anger would have been easier," I said. "But it wouldn't have helped." Driving home that night, I thought about how easily everything could have gone another way. How I could have knocked that day and never known. How I could have confronted her immediately and turned hurt into conflict. How silence or anger might have changed the outcome entirely. But I didn't regret the way it happened. Some truths need to be overheard before they can be understood. Back at home, I moved through the familiar rooms with a quiet sense of ownership. This wasn't a place I waited in. It was a place I lived in. I rearranged the living room slightly, not for company, but for comfort. I moved the chair closer to the lamp. I placed a small table beside it, just large enough for a book and a cup. The change was subtle, but it mattered. It felt like a declaration I didn't need to say out loud. This space is mine. One morning, I found myself at the kitchen sink again, rinsing a cup, adjusting the water temperature without thinking. The same habit, the same quiet. But this time, the quiet felt different. It didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. I understood then that the most painful part of that day outside her house hadn't been what I heard. It had been realizing how easily I'd stepped aside without noticing. And the most important part of this ending wasn't reconciliation or apology. It was the moment I stopped shrinking. Some lessons don't come with warnings. Some clarity arrives when you're standing still, listening, not because you're meant to act immediately, but because you're meant to change internally first. I didn't lose my place in my daughter's life. I found my own again, and that was enough. If this story feels familiar, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever learned the truth by accident? And if you value stories told with honesty and dignity, please subscribe to this channel.